When you're talking about the arteries of the brain, so first of all, you need to understand that the arterial supply of the brain, it comes from two arterial systems, right? And these two arterial systems, they basically form a circle of Willis. Now, when you talk about the two main arterial supply or arterial systems that supply the brain, so you should be familiar with the internal carotid artery and the vertebral basilar system. So you have internal carotid system, internal carotid artery system, and then you have the vertebral basilar system. So basically, you have two internal carotid arteries and two vertebral arteries supplying your entire brain, and they basically form a circle of Willis exactly where in the base of the brain. Also, this is arch of aorta, so let's just go a little back. So this is arch of aorta. Now this on the right side will have the right brachiocephalic artery. So brachiocephalic. This will divide into a common carotid artery and a subclavian artery. And then here you have your left common carotid and left subclavian. So basically SC, right? So that's how you need to remember SC, right? So yes. And this is brachiocephalic, which is only available in the right side. Now what happens is this the common carotid artery, it gives branch called internal and external carotid artery. So right now the artery that we're talking about is internal carotid artery, and it's a branch of the common carotid arteries, right? Clear. And when you talk about the vertebral arteries are basically branches of the first part of the subclavian artery. So subclavian arteries branch is vertebral artery, right? So we've established that as well. So we know both the branches now. Now, when you talk about the blood supply, so you look at it in two aspects. One is the anterior aspect, the other is the posterior aspect. And bear in mind that posterior cerebral artery comes in the posterior aspect, right? Now, when you talk about the anterior aspect, that is mainly supplied by the internal carotid artery. So here's your major internal carotid artery. So basically, if there's arch of aorta here, so this is your internal carotid artery going, right? Now, when internal carotid artery, arch of aorta, then common carotid artery, then internal carotid artery. When internal carotid artery is going, obviously it's going to give off some branches. So it gives off middle cerebral artery, it gives off anterior cerebral artery, and it also gives off posterior communicating artery. Before telling you about the branches, I need to make you familiar with cerebral and cerebellar. So you have anterior cerebral artery, and then you have the anterior communicating artery, right? Here you have the posterior cerebral artery, but here is the posterior communicating artery. So posterior communicating, and this is the posterior cerebral. This is the anterior cerebral, posterior cerebral. This is the middle cerebral. Fine. So you have three cerebral arteries. When you talk about cerebellar, so you have ICA, which is anterior inferior cerebellar artery, ICA, and then you have the PICA, which is posterior inferior cerebellar artery, and then you have superior cerebellar artery. So you have three cerebellar arteries: superior cerebellar artery, anterior cerebellar artery, and posterior inferior cerebellar artery, right? And when you talk about cerebral, so you have anterior, middle, and posterior cerebral artery. You also have a posterior communicating artery, right? Now, when you talk about the branches of internal carotid arteries, so those supply the anterior part of the brain or anterior, they form the anterior part of the circle of Willis, right? So here. So that internal carotid artery, it will have branches as middle cerebral, anterior cerebral, and posterior communicating artery. I hope you can understand that. Anterior cerebral, middle cerebral, and posterior communicating. Easy. When you talk about the posterior aspect of the circle of Willis, it is formed by the vertebral basilar arteries, right? And particularly, what happens is that these are the vertebral arteries which arise from the first part of the subclavian vein. So these are your vertebral arteries. Vertebral arteries, they come together to give you a basilar artery, and these basilar arteries give off small pontine arteries, right? So vertebral arteries, they come together to form a basilar artery. And where does this happen? This happens in the region of pons. That's the reason pontine arteries. So vertebral and basilar. Now what happens is that, and these, what are the branches of the vertebral basilar system? So you have your, first of all, you have the pica, then you have the ica, and then you have the superior cerebellar artery, and then you have the posterior cerebral artery. This also comes in the posterior region. So you have four arteries. It was better if this was also associated with these, and we were done with the cerebral separately and cerebellar separately. But now this is how you have to learn it and remember it for life. Fine. So the four branches here: ica, pica, pica, and then posterior cerebral, and then superior cerebellar, posterior cerebral, right? And when you talk about anterior, internal carotid artery is the main blood supply. Its branches are anterior cerebral, middle cerebral, and posterior communicating. Easy. So these are the two. arterial systems that you should be aware of. And also, you can see that this is the diagram that shows you how it goes about. So basically, internal carotid artery, and it has these branches. Cerebral portion has ophthalmic branch. There are further more branches. So ophthalmic artery, posterior communicating artery. So right now, what are we talking about? We're talking about the internal carotid artery and the cerebral portions. So you have the posterior communicating. Yes, I showed you already that. But extra, you can remember choroidal and ophthalmic also. So this is extra information for you. Ophthalmic and choroidal. It has anterior cerebral artery. Yes, this is also a cerebral artery. And it has a middle cerebral. So anterior cerebral, middle cerebral, and posterior communicating. Other than that, choroidal and ophthalmic. Easy. So these were the branches of your internal carotid artery. When you talk about the vertebral artery, I told you it's a branch of the first part of subclavian artery. Now, what are the further branches of the vertebral artery itself? So I told you it has pica, remember? So yes, pica posteriorly, if you can recall. So this is the vertebral artery, and vertebral artery's direct branch is posterior inferior cerebral artery. Whereas when you talk about ICA and superior cerebellar artery and posterior cerebral artery, these all are the branches of basilar artery. So this is basilar artery and it gives off these three branches. I hope that's clear now. So here, posterior inferior cerebellar artery. Easy. This is from the which artery exactly? These were the vertebrals. So it gave off pica. Other than that, it also gives anterior spinal artery right here. If you can recall, this is anterior spinal artery. So this is also a branch of the vertebral artery. So this is vertebral artery, anterior spinal, and posterior and superior cerebellar artery. So pica is here, anterior spinal artery is there. Other than that, it also gives you posterior spinal artery. It gives you meningeal branches as well, right? And then medullary arteries as well. So there are five branches. Then if you talk about basilar artery, so this and then these were the basilar. Remember in pons you have basilar arteries, it has pontine arteries, labyrinthine arteries. Other than that, very important, it has ICA, superior cerebellar artery, and the posterior cerebral artery, if you can recall. So yeah, easy. So yeah, that's pretty much about it, and I hope you can recall what all I've said. And I told you branches for vertebral artery, then I told you branches for basilar artery separately, and then I told you branches for the internal carotid artery separately. Then I told you the anterior aspect and posterior aspect. And if anyone asks you, in short, you can just tell that the anterior aspect is supplied by internal carotid artery, and its main branches are middle cerebral, anterior cerebral, and posterior communicating. The posterior part is supplied by the vertebro-basilar arteries. So two vertebral arteries, they come together and they form basilar and it gives off pontine, right? So but what forms this circle of Willis is formed by the posterior cerebral, superior cerebellar, and then ICA and PICA, posterior and inferior cerebellar arteries. So here also you can just have a look. So yeah, that's pretty much it.